Nick Humphrey even reported that she was able to catch a fly in mid-flight.
Matthias Michel, what is perceptual reality monitoring?
All right. Excellent first question. Perceptual reality monitoring is this capacity that you have to tell what's coming, which signals reflect what's just happening in your mind versus which signals in your brain come from reality. So it's important to realize that whenever you have internal signals, such as perceptual signals, those perceptual signals could be there for a variety of reasons. One reason is because you're seeing the stuff. So, for example, suppose you have visual signals indicating there's a cat out there. It could be because you're seeing a cat, but it could also be because of noise. So we know that inside your brain there's noise, there's spontaneous activity, right? And sometimes those bursts of spontaneous activity can be almost as high as the activity you get if you actually see the thing. There's a study by Schwartz and colleagues looking at this for faces, for example. So we know that these spontaneous bursts of activity can be pretty high, pretty strong, but you're not spending your days hallucinating faces, right, or cats. So that's one reason the cat signals could be activated. Another reason could be you're maintaining a picture of a cat in working memory, right? So that could be you're maintaining a picture of a cat in your mind. That could be another reason why um, your cat neurons, so to speak, are activated. Another reason could be that you're expecting to see a cat. Okay. The very important thing is that although in all those cases, you have a mental representation that there's a cat, you mentally represent cats. In all those cases, you should not believe that there's a cat, right? You should only believe that there's a cat when there's actually a cat in front of you. So the idea is that you need perceptual reality monitoring. You need to make sure that those mental representations, when they're activated because of noise or because you're expecting to see a cat, those representations don't mislead you into believing that there's actually a cat out there. And if you think that uh, the we have the kinds of cognitive systems that rely on predictions and simulations, uh, it's often going to be the case that you're just simulating the presence of a cat, but that shouldn't lead you to believe that there's a cat in front of you. So that's why we need reality monitoring.
Yes, super cool. Well explained. I've always thought that's a fascinating question. How does the brain tell the difference between imagination, perception, memory, noise? I don't know if there's a fifth option, but those seem like the four. How does the brain do that? So is this a statistical pattern in the data? Is it sort of like analyzing the stats? How is it doing that sort of discrimination? What signal is unique to each of those types that allows it to classify it?
Right. So one thing is signal to noise ratio. So when the thing is really out there, the signal is stronger compared to the background noise inside your head, right? And so you can use that as a cue. Now, it's not only signal to noise ratio, presumably. Um, Another way of telling apart simulation from reality is that simulation in part depends on, well, often, it's not always the case, but often depends on what you want to do. Okay. So, for example, mental imagery might be voluntary in a way that perception is not voluntary. Now, you might say this is not totally uh, completely true because part of perception is, of course, under voluntary control, right? I can choose to move my eyes and turn my head and so on and so forth. So just because it's voluntary doesn't mean that it's not real. But it's one cue you can use in order to determine whether the thing is real or not. Another thing is how predictable it is. So somewhat paradoxically, if something is totally unpredictable, you're going to tend to think that it's not real, because one way of seeing this is imagine that there's a pink elephant just right now appearing in front of you. Given that that doesn't make any sense in that situation, it's totally unpredictable. You should presumably think, oh, okay, I just imagined this. All right. Whereas things that are predictable are going to be the things that um, are more likely to be real, predictable in the sense that they make sense given all the background beliefs that you have.
Yes. I have an example of this. I said we were talking before we clicked record that I'm in Malaysia at the moment, and I have a terrifying fear of snakes. So I'm constantly checking bushes and trees for snake-like objects, and my prediction system seems particularly honed to hoses that have any sort of like rivets on them or any sort of patterned long thing. My heart will drop like really, really quickly, and my body will like have this really quick reaction because my prediction system is like overly predicting snake, right? So I guess that's an example.
Right.
But then, you know, 1 second later, half a second later, I correctly categorize that as hose, which it almost always is, until it's
Right.
snake, and then it's going to scare the shit out of me. But you know, like that's
Yeah.
the that's that analysis going on, right?
Yeah, that kind of analysis. But you might even think it's at a lower level than that. A good example is it turns out that because of the way the eye is constructed, is built, uh, you always get light coming into your eyes. It's always obstructed by blood vessels, right? And there are studies showing that you can actually track where those blood vessels are from activity in V1. Okay, so basically, blood vessels are casting a shadow on your retina, and you can those shadows are recorded by your neurons, or at least they are recorded in the monkeys in which they did the studies. Um, it's a study by Adams and Horton, and basically, but you know you don't spend your days feeling like you have giant spider webs on your eyes or something like that. So those shadows must somehow be filled in, right? Another thing is, you know, you always have junk in your eye floating around, but most of the time you don't see that at all. So some way somehow your brain must erase all that stuff. Um, a good example is so in the phenomenon of motion-induced blindness, you see a target, which is often a yellow target, and there's a moving background like this, rotating. Okay, and if you look at the center of this display, what you're going to find is that the yellow target disappears from consciousness. Now, we know that the yellow target, even though it disappears from consciousness, it is still perceived because your brain can still update things about that target. Okay. So, for example, if the target suddenly changes from yellow to pink, all of a sudden it's going to pop back into consciousness. Or if you have two targets and previously they were totally unrelated, but now there's a line between them that's going to constitute an object. And unconsciously, you're going to update that representation from two objects to one object, which means that the next time they come back into consciousness, it's more likely they come back together because now they're considered as one object. Okay? So we know that we continually update those representations.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing is, why does that happen? Well, one hypothesis by Brian Shaw is that this happens because your your brain thinks it's very, very unlikely that there's a stationary target on a rotating background. You know, things usually move around coherently. And because this thing is not moving on a moving background, it's more likely that it comes from inside my eye, right? And so your brain erases it from your consciousness
Very
because
cool.
it's very unlikely that it comes from the environment. So that's a case where you have reality monitoring erasing some stuff from your conscious experience because your brain, so to speak, thinks that it's something coming from your eye, not something coming from the environment.
Yes. Cool example. Yeah. Do you think you mentioned the word hallucination briefly earlier. Do you think a core part of conditions like schizophrenia and psychosis is whatever brain mechanism is doing this signal discrimination is just not categorizing these signals right? The brain cannot figure out what's internal, what's external, what's noise, what's memory, and it starts again just kind of mislabeling it. Do you think that that's a
Yeah,
strong part of that
definitely.
pathophysiology?
So phenomena like schizophrenia are extremely complex. So it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to reduce, those very complex phenomena to one cause. But surely one possibility is that in some cases there are problems with this reality monitoring mechanism, definitely. So that it doesn't have the right threshold. Some things that should fall below the threshold are now above the threshold, and so you're going to consciously experience those things, whereas normal people don't consciously experience those things, or
Right.
at least if they experience them, they think it's coming from inside, not from the outside world. Yeah.
Yes. Do we know what part of the brain is doing this? And do we have good experimental evidence, a brain in real time categorizing those different signals and correctly putting it in the right box?
Yeah, so there is some evidence about this. Most of it has been done by Nadine Dijkstra, who's a neuroscientist who works on the topic, and Steve Fleming at UCL, University College London. And it seems that the regions that are responsible for this might be in the prefrontal cortex, so the front of the head, which is not totally surprising if you think that prefrontal cortex is involved in metacognition. Okay, there's a lot of evidence that prefrontal cortex is involved in, explicit confidence ratings. For example, if I ask you to decide whether what you're seeing is a triangle or a cross, for example, um, your prefrontal and then assess your confidence in that decision, your prefrontal cortex is going to encode your confidence, or so it seems. Now, there's not as much stuff done on the neural basis of reality monitoring because it's a kind of new topic. There's some stuff on source monitoring. Source monitoring is slightly different. It's being able to tell the source of your memory. So, for example, being able to tell whether uh, I, you remember something because you imagined it or because you saw it. Uh, this is a slightly different topic, and I think the neural bases are slightly different. I don't remember exactly what those are for source monitoring.
Yeah. So does perceptual reality monitoring make the claim that someone shouldn't be able to be conscious without a frontal cortex?
Yes, if you get bilateral lesions to prefrontal cortex, then you lose phenomenal consciousness. That's one of the claims of the theory. Now, this is a topic that's been discussed quite a bit. The problem is that there's a huge selection bias in the studies that look at people with massive lesions to prefrontal cortex. Um, why? Because prefrontal cortex is a huge part of your brain. If you have people who have massive lesions to prefrontal cortex, cannot do anything. Okay, if the lesions are massive enough, they can't do anything. They can't be tested, and so the only patients who can be tested tend to be those patients who don't have such massive lesions. And so it might give the illusion that the results you get are in conflict with that prediction. It's just because we can't test the people who do have the relevant lesions. As a
Right.
matter of fact, people who think prefrontal cortex is not involved in consciousness usually think that prefrontal cortex is involved in reports about consciousness. Okay, so there's people who think you know prefrontal cortex is relevant for phenomenal consciousness itself, and other people who think no, it's not responsible for phenomenal consciousness. It's just responsible for thinking about phenomenal consciousness or reporting about your phenomenal consciousness. And then they're going to say, well, some evidence of this is this lesion studies indicating that you can have preserved phenomenal consciousness without PFC. But if you think about it for 5 seconds, this argument is actually contradicting. It's actually contradicting their own view, right? If their view is right, if it's really true that prefrontal cortex is involved in reports about consciousness, those people with complete lesions of prefrontal cortex should look like they're unconscious. They should look like they don't have phenomenal consciousness, or at least they should report no phenomenal consciousness, right? Oh, sorry. They should not report phenomenal consciousness, not report no phenomenal consciousness, right? So there's a subtle dialectic here surrounding the role of prefrontal cortex for consciousness and
Yes.
what we can really learn from lesions. I'm kind of skeptical that we can learn all that much from lesions for the reasons I just described.
Right. I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Solms's ideas of, brainstem being the major originator of consciousness. And he brings up these clinical studies where people are missing, 90% of their brain, all of their cortex is missing. They're effectively, I think it's basically just like a brainstem, a reticular system. I don't even know if they have like a thalamus or but I'm not entirely sure how much, but it's almost entirely the brain is missing. But these patients still seem to have some level of phenomenal consciousness. Now, maybe you can bring up your argument that you can't ask them as such, so it's very hard to tell. But from the outside, it seems like they do have it. What would you say to those cases?
So I'm quite skeptical of cases like these. In many cases, the remaining tissue has not been properly evaluated. In many of those cases, like the most drastic cases, people die pretty quickly, unfortunately, and so we can't really evaluate them. Um, in the few cases in which sometimes it might look from the MRI that there's nothing at all, but in some cases the cortex is compressed instead of being totally absent. So those MRI pictures you see sometimes are somewhat misleading.
Right.
And then there's the issue of what are the criteria for assessing consciousness. In some cases, what they say is, look, the person is going to follow your finger with their eyes as you move your eyes. But we know that this is something that can be done totally unconsciously, right? So, for example, if you look at blindsight patients, and the best example might be Helen, who was a blindsight monkey. She had total lesions of V1. As far as we can tell, the evidence seems to indicate that she had no phenomenal conscious vision. Still, she was able to follow things around. Nick Humphrey even reported that she was able to catch a fly in mid-flight, right?
Without conscious vision. Explain that. I think it's very hard for someone at home to understand maybe what that sentence means. I guess, fully cortically blind people are maybe the only people that can identify with that. What does that mean to be fully consciously blind, no conscious visual system, but have unconscious visual processing?
So here's a fun anecdote. My colleague and mentor, Hakwan Lao, had tested a patient who has blind sight on one side. Okay. So he reports he can't see anything to the right. And, some people have said, in those cases, maybe they have degraded conscious experiences and so on and so forth. So Hakwan wanted to have some kind of full report of, GY, describe what it's like in your right visual field. Just tell me what it's like as best you can. Okay. And his answer was, please tell me what it's like to see behind your head. Okay. There's nothing. There's nothing.
Yes.
Nothing at all. However, if you force the guy to choose between two options, he's going to be able to guess at 90% correct in some cases. Okay, often it's going to be around 60% correct if chance is 50. But you can find cases where performance is very high, and yet he reports no awareness whatsoever. So unconscious vision is really vision, but there's nothing it's like. There's nothing it's like for you. A good example, if you want to see what it's like, is just to do the motion-induced blindness. So you can go on YouTube and you'll find videos of motion-induced blindness. And in some cases, the dot is conscious. In some cases, it becomes unconscious and then it comes back to consciousness and so on and so forth. Clearly, there's nothing it's like as the dot moves away from consciousness. There's nothing
Right.
it's like for you to see the dot. But I can prove that you're still seeing it in some sense, right? Because you're updating that mental representation of the dot, and so on and so forth. And there are many cases like this where you can show that you're responsive to features that you don't consciously experience.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel